Everyone thought I had ruined the most important dinner of the year, but the truth was far stranger. I had just saved the life of the most dangerous man in New York without realizing who he was. My name is Emily Carter, and if you had walked into Bellissimo Steakhouse that Friday night, you probably would have remembered me for all the wrong reasons. I was the chubby waitress trying to balance a silver tray through a maze of expensive suits and sparkling dresses while pretending not to notice the whispers that always seemed to follow me. At 27, I had learned that people often judged me before I even opened my mouth. Some customers smiled politely. Others looked right through me. A few stared just long enough to remind me that kindness wasn't always fashionable. But I had something they didn't expect. I noticed everything. Every nervous glance. Every shaking hand. Every detail that didn't belong. The dinner rush had swallowed the restaurant whole. Crystal glasses chimed together beneath golden chandeliers while a jazz trio played softly near the fireplace. The scent of grilled steaks, rosemary, and fresh bread floated through the air, mixing with expensive cologne and the quiet confidence of people who never worried about paying a bill. I adjusted my apron, balanced another tray on my shoulder, and reminded myself that only 3 more hours stood between me and the end of my shift. Then the front doors opened. The room changed before I even looked up. Conversation softened. Waiters straightened their backs. Even our manager stopped talking mid-sentence. Damian Moretti stepped inside wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that somehow made everyone else seem underdressed. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. Confidence followed him like a shadow. For men walked several steps behind him, but somehow he still looked completely alone. Calm. Controlled. Impossible to read. I had no idea he was one of the most powerful men in the city. To me, he was simply another customer sitting at table 12. I grabbed a bottle of reserve Cabernet and headed toward his table, weaving between guests laughing over anniversary dinners and business deals. That's when something caught my attention. Not Damien. Not his security team. The wine glass waiting in front of his empty chair. It looked perfectly polished beneath the chandelier, but a tiny streak along the rim reflected the light differently than the others. Barely noticeable. Almost invisible. I slowed my pace. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe 12-hour shifts had finally exhausted my brain. But my father had spent 30 years inspecting restaurant equipment before he passed away, and he used to tell me the same thing every Sunday. Emily, if one detail feels wrong, stop pretending it isn't. I stared at the glass for another second. Around me, nobody noticed anything unusual. The musicians kept playing. Guests laughed. Silverware clinked against porcelain. Damien reached for the chair, preparing to sit down. My heartbeat climbed into my throat. I didn't know why. I only knew that every instinct I had was screaming at me not to let that glass reach his hand. Before my mind could argue, my feet were already moving. My tray slipped from my hands before my thoughts could catch up. Crystal glasses crashed against the polished hardwood floor, and the sharp sound silenced nearly every conversation in the restaurant. Gasps echoed around me as dark red wine spread across the floor like spilled paint. I heard someone groan in frustration behind me, and our manager whispered my name with the kind of disappointment I had grown used to hearing. My cheeks burned. Customers stared. A woman near the window shook her head as though she had expected someone like me to make a mistake eventually. But I never looked at them. My eyes stayed locked on that single wineglass sitting inches from Damian Moretti's hand. The one glass that had bothered me from the moment I noticed it beneath the chandelier. Before anyone could stop me, I reached across the table, grabbed the untouched glass, and pulled it away just as Damien extended his hand toward it. His security team reacted instantly. Chairs scraped across the floor. 4 men stepped closer, placing themselves between him and everyone else in the dining room without raising their voices. The entire restaurant seemed to stop breathing. I realized how reckless I must have looked. A waitress with wine on her uniform standing over an important guest while holding his glass. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard my own voice. Please do not drink this. The words came out softer than I intended. Damien did not answer right away. Instead, he looked directly into my eyes. They were an unusual shade of grey, calm enough to make me wonder if anything ever surprised him. He did not appear angry. He simply observed me the way someone studies a puzzle before moving the first piece. "Why?" he finally asked. I swallowed hard. I do not know exactly why. Something looked wrong. I knew how ridiculous that sounded the moment I said it. I had no laboratory test. No proof. Only an instinct built from years of watching tiny details while everyone else hurried through life. Behind me, our manager rushed forward, apologizing repeatedly. "Sir, I am so sorry. She is one of our servers. She has had a long shift. Please allow us to replace everything immediately." I expected Damien to dismiss me. Instead, he slowly turned his attention back to the glass still resting in my shaking hand. Without changing his expression, he spoke to one of the men beside him. "Have the sommelier bring another bottle. A sealed one." No one argued. Minutes later, the restaurant's wine expert arrived carrying another bottle directly from the cellar. He carefully opened it in front of everyone and poured it into a fresh glass that had never left its protective cabinet. Damien picked it up, studied the deep crimson color under the light, then took a slow sip. Only then did he nod once. The tension eased, but not completely. I let out the breath I had been holding and realized my hands were trembling so badly that tiny drops of wine still clung to my fingers. I started apologizing again, ready to clean the broken glass and disappear into the kitchen forever. Damien stopped me with one quiet sentence. "What is your name?" I blinked, surprised that after everything that had happened, that was the question he chose to ask. "Emily," I answered. "Emily Carter." He held my gaze for another long second before giving a small, thoughtful nod that somehow felt heavier than any speech. "Thank you, Emily." At that moment, I believed the night was finally over. I had no idea that someone across the dining room had been watching every second of our conversation with far more interest than either of us realized. The rest of my shift passed in a blur, but the feeling of Damien Moretti's steady gaze refused to leave me. I scrubbed coffee cups, carried heavy dinner plates, smiled at strangers, and apologized for delays that were not even my fault, yet every few minutes I caught myself glancing toward table 12. His conversation continued as though nothing unusual had happened, but there was something different now. Every once in a while, his eyes quietly drifted across the room until they found me again. They were never demanding. Never intimidating. They simply observed. That somehow unsettled me more than anger would have. I kept asking myself the same question. Had I overreacted? Had I embarrassed myself over a harmless reflection on a wine glass? Maybe exhaustion had played tricks on my mind. 12-hour shifts had a way of turning ordinary details into imaginary problems. Still, something deep inside me whispered that I had done the right thing, even if I could not explain why. Around 10 o'clock, the dinner crowd finally began thinning. The music softened, candles burned lower, and tired servers exchanged quiet jokes while wiping down empty tables. I was collecting folded linen napkins when our manager hurried toward me with an expression I had never seen before. Usually, he only approached me when there was another complaint or another extra task waiting. This time he looked almost nervous. "Emily," he said quietly, "the gentleman from table 12 would like a word before he leaves." My stomach tightened. I glanced across the dining room and saw Damien standing beside his chair while his companions waited near the entrance. Even from a distance, people instinctively stepped aside to let him pass. I walked over, trying to ignore the sound of my own heartbeat. "Sir," I said carefully, "I wanted to apologize again for disrupting your dinner." He shook his head once. "You have apologized enough." His voice remained calm, measured, almost gentle. "Tell me something." I nodded. "Why were you watching the glass instead of me?" The question surprised me. Most important people expected compliments about themselves. He wanted the truth instead. I looked down for a second before answering honestly. Because people can hide what they are thinking. Small details usually cannot. A faint smile almost reached the corner of his mouth before disappearing. Someone taught you that? My father, I replied. He inspected restaurants for years. He believed every accident leaves a clue before it happens. Damien remained silent for several seconds. His expression did not change, but something thoughtful settled behind his grey eyes. He sounds like a wise man. He was, I answered softly. I still hear his advice every day. Damien reached inside his jacket. For one awkward second I thought he might be reaching for his wallet to offer a reward, and I prepared myself to refuse politely. Instead, he removed a simple white business card with nothing printed on the front except his name and a phone number on the back written in dark blue ink. He placed it on the table between us instead of handing it directly to me. If you ever find yourself in trouble, he said, call this number before you decide to face it alone. I stared at the card, uncertain what to say. Before I could answer, one of the men waiting near the entrance stepped closer and quietly whispered something into Damien's ear. His expression remained composed, but his eye shifted toward the far corner of the restaurant where a man in an expensive navy suit immediately stood up, paid his bill, and walked out without looking back. Damien noticed him. So did I. Neither of us said a word, but somehow we both understood that the evening was not ending as peacefully as it appeared. The business card stayed in my apron pocket the entire drive home, though I never took it out once. My little apartment on the west side of Queens looked exactly the way I had left it that morning. A faded blue sofa, 2 overflowing bookshelves, and a tiny kitchen where the refrigerator hummed louder than the traffic outside. I kicked off my shoes, filled a glass with water, and stood by the window watching the rain collect beneath the streetlights. My grandmother used to say that storms had a way of washing away lies while leaving the truth behind. I wish that were true. Because the more I replayed the evening in my head, the less certain I felt. Maybe the strange reflection on the wineglass had meant nothing at all. Maybe Damien Moretti had simply humored an exhausted waitress who embarrassed herself in front of half the restaurant. I reached into my apron and placed the white card on the kitchen table. His name looked ordinary printed in black letters. Nothing about it hinted at the quiet authority he carried or the way an entire dining room had unconsciously followed his movements. I shook my head, laughed at myself, and decided I would never call that number. People from his world did not stay connected to people from mine. The next morning proved how wrong I was. Bellissimo Steakhouse was unusually quiet before lunch, and everyone seemed more interested in whispering than preparing tables. The moment I stepped into the staff room, conversation stopped. My friend Olivia, another server, hurried toward me with wide eyes. Emily, what exactly happened last night? She asked. The manager has been answering phone calls since 7 this morning. I frowned. Phone calls from who? She lowered her voice. Nobody knows. But whoever they are, they keep asking questions about you. A strange chill crept across my shoulders. Before I could ask anything else, our manager appeared in the doorway. His serious expression from the previous night had completely disappeared. Instead, he greeted me with a smile so forced that it almost looked painful. Emily, he said, would you come to my office for a minute? My first thought was that I had finally been fired. I followed him down the hallway rehearsing polite ways to accept the decision. Instead, he closed the office door, folded his hands on the desk, and cleared his throat. Someone contacted the restaurant this morning asking about your work record. I stared at him. Who? He hesitated. They did not identify themselves, but they seemed very interested. He opened a file and looked through several pages. They asked whether you are dependable, whether customers trust you, whether you have ever accepted money from guests, and whether you have family nearby. My heartbeat quickened. Those were not ordinary questions. What did you tell them? I asked quietly. He smiled, this time with genuine warmth. I told them that in 5 years you have never once given me a reason to doubt your honesty. That you stay late whenever someone needs help. That you treat every customer exactly the same, whether they order a $10 sandwich or a $300 steak. I looked away, suddenly embarrassed by the unexpected praise. As I stepped back into the dining room a few minutes later, I noticed a black luxury sedan parked across the street. The driver never got out. He simply sat behind the wheel, reading a newspaper that never seemed to turn a single page. When I looked in his direction, he lowered the paper just enough for our eyes to meet before calmly driving away. For the next several days, life should have returned to normal, but normal quietly disappeared without asking my permission. Every morning when I walked to work, I noticed the same feeling before I noticed the people. It was the strange certainty that someone had already seen me before I reached the corner coffee shop or crossed the busy intersection outside the subway station. Nothing obvious ever happened. No one spoke to me. No one followed close enough to make me afraid. Yet tiny details kept repeating themselves. The same black luxury sedan appeared on different streets at different times. The same elderly man seemed to read a newspaper outside the bakery every afternoon, although I never once saw him buy anything. Even the florist across from the restaurant smiled at me one morning and said, "You must have important friends." I laughed because I thought she was joking. Then she pointed toward a bouquet of fresh white lilies sitting inside the shop window. Attached to the arrangement was a small card with only 3 typed words. "For Emily Carter." My smile disappeared. "That is not mine," I said immediately. The florist looked confused. "The gentleman who ordered them said you would probably refuse to accept them." I stepped closer. There was no signature. No company logo. No explanation. Only a simple message beneath my name. "Congratulations on your courage." I thanked the florist but left the flowers exactly where they were. Something about anonymous gifts made me uncomfortable. They always felt less like kindness and more like unanswered questions. When I arrived at Bellissimo, Olivia noticed I looked distracted before I even tied my apron. "You look like you barely slept," she said while polishing silverware. I smiled weakly. "Maybe I watched too many mystery movies." She laughed, but my thoughts stayed somewhere else. Around noon, our lunch crowd began filling the dining room. Business executives, tourists, retired couples, families celebrating birthdays. It was busy enough to keep my mind occupied until the front doors opened again. Damien Moretti entered alone this time. No long table. No formal meeting. No crowd surrounding him. He chose a quiet booth near the windows where sunlight reflected softly against the polished wood. The entire restaurant recognized him from the previous week, but unlike everyone else, he behaved as though this were simply another ordinary lunch. Our manager rushed over, ready to assign another server, but Damien glanced across the room and calmly said, "I would prefer Emily." Every pair of eyes turned toward me. My manager nodded so quickly that I barely had time to protest before I found myself carrying a menu toward his table. "Good afternoon," I said as professionally as I could. "Welcome back." He looked up from the leather menu with the same calm grey eyes. "Good afternoon, Emily." There was no arrogance in his voice. No attempt to impress anyone. He simply spoke my name as though he respected it. I poured ice water into his glass, making absolutely certain this one came directly from the clean rack beside the service station. He noticed the extra care and almost smiled again. "You still inspect every detail," he said quietly. I shrugged. "Old habits are difficult to break." "Some habits are worth keeping," he replied. Before I could answer, he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "You left something behind." I unfolded it and froze. It was the white business card he had given me days earlier. Untouched. Perfectly clean. I looked up in confusion. Damien's expression remained unreadable as he said, "Good. That tells me you have not needed to use it yet. I hope you never do." At that moment, I still believed our conversation was nothing more than an unusual coincidence. I did not realize someone sitting near the front window had quietly taken a photograph of both of us before disappearing into the afternoon crowd. After Damien left the restaurant, I stood at the service station much longer than necessary, staring at the business card resting in my hand before slipping it back into my apron. Olivia bumped my shoulder with a playful smile. "You know," she whispered, "most women would not hand back a card from someone like him." I laughed, but it sounded forced even to my own ears. "Most women are probably smarter than I am." She rolled her eyes. Or maybe they just enjoy complicated lives. I did not answer because I had no intention of becoming part of anyone else's complicated life. I wanted predictable mornings, honest work, and enough money to pay my rent on time. That was all. Unfortunately, life had already started making different plans. 2 days later, my shift ended just after 9 in the evening. A cool breeze drifted between the buildings as I stepped outside carrying my backpack over one shoulder. The sidewalks were still busy with people leaving restaurants and theaters, and for the first few blocks everything felt perfectly ordinary. Then I noticed it again. Not footsteps. Not voices. Just the unmistakable feeling that someone was paying closer attention than they should. I slowed near a bookstore window, pretending to admire the display while using the reflection in the glass. Across the street, a man wearing a dark baseball cap seemed unusually interested in checking his phone. When I started walking again, he did the same. Maybe it was coincidence. New York was full of coincidences. I turned left instead of following my usual route toward the subway. 30 seconds later, I saw the same reflection behind me. My heartbeat quickened. I reminded myself not to panic. My father had always said that fear made people stop noticing details. So I forced myself to breathe slowly. A delivery truck rumbled past, briefly blocking the sidewalk. When it cleared, the man had disappeared. Relief washed over me for exactly 3 seconds. Then my phone vibrated. An unknown number had sent a single text message. "Be careful walking home alone." I stopped moving altogether. There was no signature. No explanation. Only those 5 words glowing against the screen. A cold chill settled across my shoulders. Someone clearly knew where I was. Before I could decide whether to ignore the message or call the police, another notification appeared. This one contained only an address less than a block away and one sentence beneath it. "There is a 24-hour coffee shop on the corner. Stay there for 10 minutes. Help is already coming." Every instinct told me not to trust anonymous messages. Yet every instinct also told me that whoever sent them already knew far more about my evening than a stranger should. I hurried toward the brightly lit cafe, choosing a seat beside the front window where dozens of people surrounded me. My hands trembled around a paper cup of hot chocolate while I watched traffic crawl through the intersection. Exactly 8 minutes later, the familiar black luxury sedan rolled quietly to the curb. The driver stepped out, walked inside, and approached my table with calm professionalism. "Miss Carter," he said politely, "Mr. Moretti asked me to make sure you arrived somewhere safe." I stared at him in disbelief. How did he even know where I was? The driver hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Because someone else has started asking the same questions about you that he asked last week, and unlike Mr. Moretti, their intentions are not as kind." The driver introduced himself as Victor and never once acted as though my questions were unreasonable. He simply waited until I finished my hot chocolate before opening the cafe door for me. The black sedan glided through the quiet streets without music or conversation, and I kept watching the city. Light slide across the windows while trying to understand how my ordinary life had become tangled with someone like Damien Moretti. Victor finally broke the silence. "Mr. Moretti asked me to tell you one thing." I looked over. "What is that?" He kept his eyes on the road. "None of this is your fault." Those words settled heavily in my chest because they answered the very question I had been asking myself every night. Had I made a mistake by stopping him from drinking that glass of wine? Had I unknowingly stepped into a world that was never meant for me? Victor dropped me in front of my apartment building and waited until I reached the front entrance before driving away. It should have made me feel safer. Instead, it made me realize someone believed I actually needed protection. The next morning, I tried to convince myself everything would finally calm down. I arrived at Bellissimo early, tied my apron, and buried myself in preparing the dining room before customers arrived. For almost 3 peaceful hours, nothing unusual happened. Then Olivia hurried into the kitchen carrying her phone. "Emily," she whispered, "someone has been asking about you online." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She showed me a neighborhood community page where someone had posted a blurry photograph taken through the restaurant window. It showed Damien sitting across from me while I held his business card. The caption beneath it read, "Does anyone know this waitress?" Several strangers had already guessed my name. Others claimed I worked at Bellissimo. One comment stood out more than the rest. "She seems important to him now." My stomach tightened. It was only a photograph, but somehow it felt like an invisible line had been crossed. Our manager immediately asked the staff not to discuss the picture with customers, yet by lunchtime whispers had already spread through the dining room. Some guests smiled at me with curiosity. Others stared a little longer than usual. I hated every second of it. Just before my shift ended, a young delivery courier walked inside carrying a small insulated bag. "Delivery for Emily Carter," he announced. Everyone looked at me. Confused, I accepted the package and signed the receipt. Inside was not food but a neatly wrapped container holding my favorite tomato basil soup from the little cafe 3 blocks away. Beneath it rested a handwritten note. "You skipped lunch yesterday. Please remember to take care of yourself." There was no signature because there did not need to be one. Somehow Damien had noticed something even I had forgotten. I smiled despite myself, then quickly folded the note before anyone else could read it. At that exact moment, Victor appeared quietly in the restaurant entrance. He did not step farther inside. His expression alone told me something had changed. I walked toward him, my pulse already quickening. He spoke softly so only I could hear. "Miss Carter, Mr. Moretti would like you to leave through the back entrance today." I stared at him. "Why?" Victor glanced toward the front windows where afternoon sunlight reflected off passing traffic. "Because the man who took your photograph has been waiting across the street for almost 2 hours, and Mr. Moretti has decided that today he is no longer willing to leave your safety to chance." Victor led me through the employee hallway, past the kitchen where pots still simmered and cooks laughed as though the world outside had not changed at all. He opened the back service door, and cool autumn air rushed inside carrying the scent of rain and fresh bread from the bakery across the alley. The black sedan waited quietly with its engine running. I hesitated before climbing inside because accepting the ride felt like accepting that my life no longer belonged entirely to me. Victor noticed my uncertainty but said nothing. He simply closed the door and pulled away from the restaurant. We drove for several minutes before the city skyline opened ahead of us. Finally, I broke the silence. "I need someone to explain what is happening." Victor nodded once. "You deserve that much." He kept both hands on the steering wheel. "The evening you stopped Mr. Moretti from drinking that wine, someone inside the restaurant was paying close attention. At first we believed they were only interested in him. Later we realized they became interested in you as well." I looked out the window, watching pedestrians hurry beneath umbrellas. "Because I interrupted whatever they expected to happen." "Yes," he answered honestly. "You changed the course of someone else's plan without ever knowing it." I leaned back against the seat, trying to process everything. "I am only a waitress." Victor smiled faintly. "Mr. Moretti said you would probably say exactly that." 20 minutes later we arrived at a quiet waterfront park overlooking the Hudson River. Damien stood alone near the railing with both hands resting in the pockets of his charcoal overcoat. The afternoon wind stirred his dark hair while ferries crossed the water behind him. He turned as I approached, and for the first time since we had met, I noticed something unexpected in his expression. He looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but emotionally burdened, like someone carrying responsibilities too heavy to put down. "Thank you for coming," he said. I folded my arms against the chilly breeze. "I am here because I need answers." "Fair enough." He gestured toward a nearby bench, and we sat facing the river. For a few moments neither of us spoke. The quiet felt strangely comfortable. Finally, Damien looked across the water instead of directly at me. "You have probably wondered why I keep involving myself in your life." I nodded. "Every day." He drew a slow breath. "It is not because I believe you owe me anything." His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. "The night we met, you acted without expecting recognition, money, or gratitude. Very few people do that anymore." I looked down at my hands. "I only followed my instincts." "Exactly," he replied. "Everyone else in that room saw influence, wealth, reputation. You saw a detail that did not belong." He paused before continuing. "People spend years trying to earn my trust. You gained it in less than a minute because you never tried." I could not think of a response. The river reflected soft streaks of afternoon sunlight while gulls drifted overhead. Damien reached into his coat and removed a small leather notebook. Inside was an old photograph of a smiling man standing beside rows of restaurant tables. I immediately recognized him. "My father," I whispered. Damien nodded. "Several years ago, before I ever met you, your father quietly warned one of my restaurants about a serious safety issue during an inspection. He refused any reward because he believed protecting people was simply the right thing to do." My throat tightened. "You knew my father?" "Only briefly," Damien answered. "But I never forgot his integrity. The night you stopped me from reaching for that glass, I realized I was looking at someone who carried the same heart." I stared at the faded photograph, overwhelmed by memories I thought time had already softened. Then Damien closed the notebook gently and said the one sentence that changed everything. "Emily, I did not begin protecting you because you saved my life. I began protecting you because your father once taught me that the greatest debt a person can carry is kindness that can never truly be repaid." The wind carried the scent of the river long after our conversation ended, and neither of us seemed eager to leave. I held my father's photograph a little longer before carefully returning it to Damien's notebook. For years I had believed that the people who remembered my father had quietly moved on with their lives, just as I had tried to do after losing him. Yet here sat a man whose entire world could not have been more different from mine, carrying a memory that had survived the passing of time. "He would have liked you," I said softly. Damien looked toward the water instead of answering immediately. "I hope he would have approved of the person I am still trying to become." There was an honesty in that sentence that surprised me more than anything else I had learned about him. For the first time, I stopped seeing the reputation that surrounded him and started seeing the man sitting beside me. Someone who carried responsibility with quiet discipline. Someone who remembered kindness long after everyone else forgot it. A week later, life began settling into something that almost resembled normal again. The photograph disappeared from social media. The unfamiliar faces outside the restaurant stopped appearing. The anonymous messages ended. I still worked long shifts at Bellissimo, still joked with Olivia while polishing silverware, and still caught myself inspecting every wineglass before placing it on a table. Only now, instead of feeling embarrassed by that habit, I smiled whenever I remembered why I had never been able to ignore small details. One rainy afternoon, Damien returned for lunch. This time there were no security concerns, no mysterious conversations, and no uncomfortable silence. He ordered soup instead of steak, thanked every employee who served him, and listened far more than he spoke. Before leaving, he placed a small envelope beside my order pad. "Open it after your shift," he said. Inside, I found a letter informing me that an anonymous donor had fully funded a scholarship in my father's name for hospitality students who demonstrated honesty, compassion, and attention to detail. My eyes filled with tears before I reached the final sentence. The scholarship committee had asked me to serve as its first volunteer mentor. I looked up just in time to see Damien waiting near the entrance. I hurried over before he stepped outside. "You did not have to do this," I whispered. He shook his head gently. "No. I wanted to." I laughed through my tears. "You still think you owe my family?" "Perhaps I always will," he answered. "Some debts are measured in dollars. Others are measured in the lives that kindness changes." Months passed, and our paths continued crossing in the most ordinary ways. Sometimes he stopped by for lunch. Sometimes I recommended a new dessert that he politely pretended to judge like an expert. Sometimes we simply shared coffee after my shift while talking about books, family, and the strange ways life connected people who should never have met. Looking back now, I realize that everyone in the restaurant that first night noticed the expensive suit, the luxury cars, and the powerful man who walked through the front door. I noticed a tiny detail on the rim of a wineglass because my father had taught me that the smallest clues often protect the biggest futures. I thought I had saved one stranger from making one mistake. I never imagined that one ordinary decision would remind two people that true strength is never found in power alone. It is found in gratitude, integrity, and the quiet courage to care when everyone else looks away. And every time I polish another glass beneath the warm lights of Bellissimo, I still hear my father's voice reminding me that the details people ignore today may become the moments that change someone's life tomorrow.